Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling, and I've been looking forward to this episode for quite a long time. I have a very, very special guest talking to today, Mr. Rob Drew. We'll get Rob to introduce himself, but he is the author of a relatively new book called Unspooled. Kind of looks like this: Unspooled, How the Cassette Made Music Shareable. And it's a fantastic read. And Rob, thank you for taking some time to talk to me. And before we get into our unspooleds, tell me a little bit about yourself and how that led. I'm assuming that what you do for a living eventually led you down the road of working on this really, really in-depth study. So yeah, tell us about yourself, Rob.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be with you here. And I love your book too. And it's just a crazy coincidence that we have the same titles for our book, but it's wonderful. Yeah, I'm a professor of communication and media in Michigan at Saginaw Valley State University. And I've always been interested in media, always been interested in music media, especially the media of delivery and distribution. So my previous one big project prior to this was about karaoke bars. So that tells you something about me. I'm always interested in the kind of interfaces between people and music media, music formats. So somewhere around the time I finished with that project, which was way back in the early 2000s, I became interested in mixtapes, where by then most people, a lot of people were making mixed CDs already, and the way people would collect music on tapes, and especially to give to other people and to share their feelings or to share their tastes or whatever it is. And looking into the history of mixtaping, I just went down the rabbit hole of cassette culture, which is a lot bigger than mixtaping. There were people, independent artists who released music on cassette, all of that, going back to the 80s. So I did the deep dive and spent about a decade or two just looking at the evolution of cassettes as as a medium or format of music distribution and redistribution.
Yeah, so a bit of a backstory too. I mean, most people that watch the channel know that a while ago, a couple of years ago, I put out my first book, Unspooled: An Adventure in Atrax, and it's coming up on about a year now. That was published independently through a Kickstarter campaign, but last year we got it over to Amazon, which made things a lot easier. And inevitably, I would check, is it listed? Is my book listed? And I would always see this book that was available for pre-order, which also had the main title of Unspooled. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then finally, once I saw that the book was available, I looked into it and read a little bit about it, and I thought, this sounds really, really interesting. And so I got in touch with Rob, and here we are now. But I mean, so I did the 8-track book out of a fascination with the collecting, and mostly being fascinated with the fact that even though we were well into the 80s, that the record clubs kept making 8-tracks available to their subscribers, which I didn't realize that was a reality until like the mid 90s. And I mean, what, you mean to tell me that in 1985, 86, 87, 8-tracks were still being made? And that's how that whole saga went. But when I saw Rob's Unspooled book, this appealed to me in a way that not even my book did, because this came out of just being fascinated with these relics that are kind of out of time. But as a young music fan in the 80s, I started off with cassettes. I recorded songs off the radio. I bought cassettes. That's how I was adding to my music collection. It was, I hadn't started buying CDs. Everybody I knew bought cassettes. So like, I grew up on cassettes. So why would I not enjoy a book about cassettes? And I have to say, I really appreciated this. When Rob sent me the book, he sent it to me along with this really cool card that has a cassette on it. So,
Yeah.
but this book is this goes deep. I
Mm.
mean, it doesn't start in the 80s, far from it. It starts all the way back to I guess the earliest recording technology, would you say?
Hmm.
Like, and there were things that in the book that I found fascinating, things that I knew a little bit about, but I didn't realize how deep it went. For example, I remember seeing the whole home taping is killing music phenomenon
Oh, yeah.
when, and I just thought, well, okay, and I knew what it was about kind of, but I didn't realize how far it went. I didn't realize that the music industry were actually trying to put a levy on the sale of blank cassette tapes, no matter what you were using them for. And it reminded me so much, and you draw these parallels, it reminded me so much of Napster and file sharing. But there's so much to dive into with Rob's Unspooled book. It really is a fascinating look at how the cassette as a form. I mean, I've got a bunch of them behind me.
I
Some of them
see.
I've had since 1987. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I've grown up with these things. I
Yeah.
can barely read the liner notes in them now, but
Hmm.
um, how even the very labels that were making money from putting albums out and selling them on cassettes, the industry as a whole tended to look down on the medium as this sort of like, you know, they're ashamed to have anything to do with them. And the idea of mixtape culture, where mixtape has become a word where I'm thinking there's probably a lot of younger people
Hmm.
that don't realize that mixtape came from a time when, yes, it was actually a mixed tape. They
Yeah.
just use it to refer to a variety of songs or a collection of songs.
Yeah.
Um, you
Yeah.
know, I can tell that a ton of research went into this, Rob, but
Hmm.
was there anything in particular in your research that I'll say particularly so many times here, that
Hmm.
you were really fascinated by and think, well, I didn't know that before. Was there anything that you found that you were like, wow, didn't realize that was?
Mm. Yeah, there were so many things, Tim, so many things. And it's like you say, because I was really thrilled to read your book and to find out so much about the history of Atrax that I didn't know. I mean, I knew they were created by Bill Lear and that it had to do with, it was in connection with uh, Ford Motor Company and things like that. But all the evolution of Atrax as a medium. And you also talked in your book, I think, about how that goes back, if we go far enough back, to reel-to-reel tapes and to wire recorders and to all those early magnetic recording technology. So that was fascinating to look into, and the way that these controversies recur. You mentioned Napster, and absolutely, it was just as big of a blow up in the 70s and the 80s. Now, at that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, for the first time in many years, the music industry, I won't say it was losing money, but it wasn't making as much as it
Right.
had been. So they were looking for sort of a scapegoat to blame that on. There were a lot of things going on. There was an economic recession, and there were video games, and suddenly kids were dropping quarters in arcade games rather than, like you and I did, going down to the corner and buying the latest single or the latest tape or something.
I would
So
say probably the decline of disco probably led to it as well.
that's a great point, is that there was a lot of mediocre music coming out. Nothing against disco, I love it. But at some point, it just became an
Was
overproduction.
oversaturated. There were the really talented artists, and then there were the second, third, fourth tier. Happens in every genre, right?
In every genre, absolutely. So there was, as you say, an attempt to create a public relations campaign against cassettes as a medium, because you have to understand that until cassettes came along, pretty much all music that people listen to on a recording medium, not counting radio and all of that, anything that they listened to that they owned was music that they had bought in a store. Now suddenly people have the ability to tape records off of their friends. And there were some excesses, frankly. There were stores, for instance, that would rent out records for the night so people could tape them. There were radio stations that would play entire albums in their entirety at midnight and say, get your tape recorders ready. So in that sense, the record companies had a lot to be, had things that they were legitimately upset about. But I think it was overkill to try to levy these royalties, as you say, which would have been exorbitant if they had been passed, might have been exorbitant enough to really discourage the use of cassettes and maybe, wipe it out as a mass medium, as they did later with digital audio tapes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. If you bought a record album,
Mhm.
you bought it. If you could lend it to someone if you wanted, but there would never be a way that they could duplicate it
Right.
to have their own copy of it.
Hmm.
And even though people did have reel-to-reel tape machines, those tended to be that tended to be hobbyists that had a little bit more, money to spend on such things. It wasn't immediately accessible. And even 8-track tapes, there were blank 8-track tapes that were sold and
Yes.
could record. I've seen recorders that hinge together, and each one had an opening for a tapes, and one was the player and one was the recorder. But I don't think those were very common either. And plus, you had to deal with the fact that you had the 4 programs, and that you had to make sure you had enough room. So cassettes just made it, by no fault of the cassette itself, the technology simply made it very easy, very portable, very convenient.
Hmm.
And I used to have dozens of cassettes recorded songs off the radio,
Hmm.
to the point where there are certain songs where I used to listen to those tapes so much. There are still certain places and songs at the end where I never used to know actually how the song completely faded out, because I'm used to the DJ's voice coming on. And I mean, I know about that too. I mean, I work in radio, so I was on both sides of that. But you're right.
Yeah.
It was really sort of this. It probably wasn't the smartest thing on behalf of probably like the more FM rock, album-oriented rock stations
Hmm.
to announce. It's one thing, we're going to premiere the latest Led Zeppelin album at 9
Yeah.
o'clock and leave it at that. It's like, yeah, we know probably a lot of you are ready to set it up and record, but they
Yeah.
didn't need to say it. So
Oh,
that probably didn't help the case that much. But
yeah, you're right.
um, it never went very far because there were too many arguments against it. And honestly, I don't think it hurt the music industry that much. And as you say, it spawned entire musical movements in the indie scene, where, because now you did not have to go into a recording studio and pay so much an hour to
Hmm.
record your
Hmm.
music. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, it wasn't the best sounding, but it became a way to make music and distribute it and copy it quite quickly and build a local reputation for yourself. So I actually think it was good for the music industry that we had, the good old trusty cassette. And it's really weird, but in a really cool way, to see that there are now, there's a lot of albums that are coming out now that they're making on cassette. So
Hmm.
I don't think it'll ever completely go away. Do you?
And a few on 8-track too. They're still making.
Every once in a while, they will throw an 8-track out, which is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
8-tracks didn't seem to get the abuse that the cassette got, because I think as far as retail, the 8-tracks had kind of had their day by 1979, 1980, whereas
yeah.
cassettes were really, really popular. I can remember being 5, 6 years old around that time, and my cousins, I noticed when they stopped buying new music on 8-track and started buying them on cassettes. And
Mhm.
I didn't really think much of it. I just thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And I do remember more time spent fishing tape out of 8-track players than actually listening to music. And with cassettes, you didn't do that as much. But man, yeah, I still, when I see, for on social media, when people post some of those old blank cassette designs, takes me right back in time. It's like the old Memorex, or the multicolored tapes. I used to love getting those. I thought those were really fancy, and
Mm,
really making fancy J cards, and
hmm.
trying to write really, really neat the song titles on them. So yeah, and the mixtape thing is really interesting because I think I compare it to, now when young people, if a younger person, two generations down from me, would see like an old floppy disk, they'd say,
Hmm.
"Oh, that's a giant version of the save icon," not realizing that that's why the save icon looks the way it does, because that's how you
Right, right.
back your
Yeah,
work. It's
yeah,
it's fascinating. I've always been fascinated by the formats too, because I collect. If I like an album, if I like an artist, I try to get all the formats, and eight tracks were just one of them.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
not collecting for the sake of it. It's really all part of the bigger collection.
yeah.
But cassettes hold a special place for me because that is
Hmm.
how I started. I logged a lot of hours listening to cassettes on my
Hmm.
Walkman, or well, I never actually had an actual Sony Walkman, but whatever the knockoff brand was.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, it's fascinating to me that the cassette, even though the industry pretty much obliterated it, it just won't go away. It refuses to
Yeah,
go. And
yeah.
people still,
Mhm.
kids will get, cell phone cases that look like cassettes. They may
Right,
not,
right.
it's just, there's
Yeah.
something cool about it. It's an icon.
Yeah, and it's funny what you mentioned earlier that they have made a bit of a revival, and there's a lot of discussion of that. But there's also a lot of debate about how many of those cassettes that get bought today do they actually get listened to? Because a lot of them include a download code in them so that you could just download the digital files. And the cassette is such an iconic object. I think the ape track too. I mean, to me, it's an iconic object, but the cassette, I think a lot of kids will buy them, especially when I say kids, of course, I mean 20 or 30-year-olds,
Yeah.
but at concerts or at club shows, when they go to the merch table and there's the t-shirts and this and that, and there's a cassette. A cassette is something you can buy for $5 from a band, make a little contribution to the band, put it in your pocket and bring it home. And you may not even listen to it, but you have the download code. I think a lot of people who buy cassettes, frankly, I'm not sure if they even have working players, but it's become such an iconic object that people will have them just to have around or post pictures of them on Instagram or whatever.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I still buy CDs too, and CDs are my main listening medium. And the
Mhm.
main reason is that I tend to think that it's not like in the 80s where you buy a cassette and you listen to it all the time, and then, it starts to wear after a while. Oh, I'll just buy another one. Well, some of these are just limited time things, so you don't want to do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But I like the idea that it's got young people interested in buying physical media again, because I
Mhm.
think there's such inexperience, and kids in the 60s and 70s experienced this with vinyl, and obviously vinyl is the superior medium for
Yes.
enjoying the artwork and the gatefold, and you get to see everything. But
Yeah.
for me, with my cassette, when I would buy a cassette, I didn't just listen to it. I would buy the cassette. We were driving somewhere and I'd be sitting in the back. I would scour the liner notes.
Mm.
I would learn everything about who
Mhm.
produced this album, who engineered it, who mastered it,
Yeah.
who took the
Yeah.
photos,
Mhm.
uh, who do they thank, what kind of instrument, what brands of instruments do they play. I would take all of that in, and that just led to this mad music collection that I
Mhm.
have now. And you know what? Because CDs, I don't remember. I do really don't remember many people having CDs till around 1990, 91, where I lived. I know they've been out for years,
Yeah.
but people still bought cassettes. And I remember CDs. The first time I bought a CD, when we had a player in the house, they still came in the long boxes.
Mm.
And I
Yes.
wasn't even sure how these things worked. And I'd opened the
Mhm.
bottom up, and this little disc fell out, or this
Yeah.
little case fell out. I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember around 2009, 2010, when vinyl, it wasn't such a big deal to say, hey, such and such has a new album out. They're putting it out on vinyl. now that's an accepted
Oh,
uh,
sure.
part of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you have like record store day and things like that, that's all they put out are vinyl, right?
Yes.
Um,
Uh-huh.
and it's starting to get that way with cassettes. It's like it's not a big deal to have a new release come out on cassette. And you go into a record store now and they have a few, not many, but they have a few cassettes on the counter for
Yeah.
sale. And it's like, this is crazy. I never thought I'd see this again in my lifetime.
Yeah, and it is funny that the vinyl's uh younger brother, inferior, or you know, that what the way the tape was usually thought of was as the ugly stepbrother of vinyl back in the old days. And here they are, they're both back. Tapes on a much smaller level. I mean, uh, uh, vinyl albums have sold. There have been over 1 billion vinyl albums sold a year in the past couple of years, and they actually outsell CDs now. And tapes, not even 1 million really a year.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's never going to be more than a niche
right,
thing,
right.
but
Yeah.
I wrote a book about 8 tracks. Niche is where I live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that. But yeah, tapes, the fact that they're so small, that was part of the both the plus and the minus. As I say, you could stick it in your pocket, you could throw them around, you could bring them in the car, they were pretty durable. But then again, as far as sales, that's another reason they didn't like them as far as sales, because you talk about reading the liner notes of the cassettes in the back of the car. When I was a kid, we had those big gatefold albums that we would, put on the headphones, get the big gatefold vinyl albums, and all that artwork and the lyrics and all of that. And that was sort of the peak audiophile experience of the time. So the industry disliked tapes, not only in terms of their sound and the fact they were recordable, but the physical, they just didn't have the physical presence that vinyl albums did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right, and I think that's something that 8 tracks had too initially, because my understanding is that 8 tracks initially were more durable than cassettes,
Hmm.
when they
Hmm.
started out, and also the ability to, chuck an 8 track player in your vehicle, and you could listen to whatever you wanted when you wanted.
Yeah.
Never mind that the songs are all out of order and some of them cut halfway through until the next program changes. Now, cassettes changed that because cassettes followed the 1 and 2, side
Right.
one, side two,
Right.
the way that a record album,
Yeah.
they held more music per cassette. But yeah, it was definitely the portability would win out because, you know, uh, you lose so much detail shrinking down to the little rectangle shape or square shape
Yeah.
than you would with
Yeah.
a vinyl record. But again, it was on the go, right? It was
Yeah.
music on the go.
Yeah.
And that's what won out there. And and I remember being very excited in the late 80s when I started, older relatives that were getting rid of records and they happened to be bands that I liked. Now all of a sudden, sometimes they had lyrics in them where the cassettes didn't, and you could
Mm.
make, I never noticed that. There's somebody in the window in that record. I've never seen the back cover before. So I
Mm.
just embraced it all. I embraced all of the formats and except digital. I've never been too big on digital.
Mhm.
But in your experience, like you don't really talk about this in the book so much, but I remember a very brief period in the early 90s where they tried to introduce those digital audio cassettes, little
Yeah.
tiny ones that look more like answering machine cassettes.
Yeah.
I don't ever remember seeing those in stores in my area.
Yeah.
I see them now on eBay.
Right.
Did you ever have much experience with those, or and because that did not last long?
Yeah. Well, digital audio cassettes were an interesting case study as well, because I remember a period in the early 90s, right? When you talk about, you'd be standing on lines for concert tickets and people would be talking about, oh, now digital audio tapes are going to come out and we're all going to have digital versions of everything on tape. And that was the projection. But the industry was much more on their toes about that, and they nipped it in the bud, and they managed to get a law passed in 1992, there was a constant back and forth, as there is with every one of these formats, between the hardware and the software companies, right? Between the content companies, by which I mean record labels, and the electronics companies. And that was true with the audio, the DAT as well, but they managed to come to a rapport for that. And that was the 1992 Audio Home Recording Act, where they said precisely what they were trying to do earlier with the analog cassette. They managed to do with DAT, which is to say we're going to have royalties on all blank DATs. We're going to have royalties on all DAT recorders. So you're going to have to pay a surcharge that will go to the copyright holders, and there will be copy protection, serial copy management, which means you can make one copy, but you can't make a copy from that copy. So it was very, very restricted, which meant DAT was only used by professionals in studios and things like that. And it never became a mass medium because of all those restrictions. Couple of interesting ironies about this, Tim, was right at that time that they made the law saying no DATs without the copy management, all they finally said analog copying is okay for personal use. So in that same 1992 law, they acknowledged that analog cassettes were okay to copy for personal use. They didn't say you could share them left and right, but for the first time, that was written into law. And secondly, the one type of digital device that was excluded, that was exempted from the 1992 law was a personal computer. And that, as I understand it, was because of the lobbying of Apple. And Apple said, well, we don't copy music with a computer. Why can't we have an exemption from this crazy law making all digital devices copy protection? Well, of course, a few years later, you would see computers advertise that get this CD burner on your built into your computer so you could copy all the music you want. So it did come back to bite them, that
Pretty
exemption.
fascinating. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
fascinating, and there's a lot as you go through here. It's a fascinating look at the industry trying to come to grips with technology. Technology moves faster than the industry can keep up with it.
Yes.
That's happened
Yes.
time and time again. I think that, yeah, I think that in the 80s and in the early 90s, people thought, well, we've got it made with CDs. The files are too big to transmit, to save, to
Hmm.
share.
Hmm.
Well, then someone figured out the
The
MP3, how you
MP3.
shrink
Yeah.
it down.
Yeah.
And most people were not interested in the high fidelity. They just wanted to hear the song.
That's
And
right. That's right.
that, yeah, and then came, Napster and all the file sharing services and torrents and all of that. And yeah, it's really something. And I'm not going to get on a pedestal, but the industry was never the same after that. Like albums just did not sell after that, and it really,
Yeah.
it really made
They
a
they were
huge
losing
change.
10%. Yeah, they were losing 10% year on year revenues in the 2000s, in the noughts. Yeah, it was. And I should cite for the Apple story and some of the stuff you're talking about of the MP3. There's a book called Appetite for Self-Destruction. And for the life of me, I can't think of the author's name, but it's a terrific book. And it gets into this business of the digital audio tape, which you asked about, the fate of the digital audio tape. And it gets into the whole Napster controversy quite a bit and wonderfully, and a very readable book. So if any of your listeners come across that book, Appetite for Self-Destruction, I'd
I think I see it, Rob, while we're talking here. Appetite for Self-Destruction: The Spectacular Crash of the Record Industry
recommend.
in the Digital Age by Steve Knopper.
Nopper, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. He's
So yeah,
wonderful.
no, that looks really interesting
Yeah,
too, because
yeah.
Um, and it's really interesting to read about things that I lived through because, I was born in the early 70s, so I vaguely remember eight tracks being around. I certainly
Mhm.
remember vinyl being around, but most of my, growing up in the 80s, it was all cassettes. So
Mhm.
that's what that's what made this so appealing to me, and a catchy title too. It must be said. I thought the title was kind of
Yeah.
catchy. And yeah, is there anything else that you'd say about this book that for people to check out? Because I'm telling you right now, folks, if you're interested in this sort of like uber technical side, or fact heavy side of the music industry and music history, you got to read this book. But is there anything in here else that you would recommend? Is if you're interested in something, you'll find it in here.
Uh, I would just thank you very much for your kind words, Tim. And I guess if I had a last thought, or it would be to ask you something, or to talk just a bit about Atrax, because having been born 10 years before you in 61, my first experience with tapes was Atrax, and then I
Hmm.
discovered cassettes. So which was back then, 8 tracks were popular before cassettes. And all that stuff you talk about the programs and the splitting of the songs. I remember my parents there were so many 8 tracks sold in five and dime stores or convenience stores that were, pirated, a little shady. And
Uh-huh. Yep.
there was one Beatles record. I don't think it was an official release, but it had the song Rain, part one, and then part two. And I just always remember that being broken up, that whole business of the songs being broken up and of the reordering of the songs, which is fascinating because often performers, musicians, as well as their producers, have very clear ideas about song order when they release
Yes.
record. So
Yeah.
what was the response of art? Did you get into or get any insight into how artists and musicians and different people in the music industry, creators, responded to uh, the release of 8 tracks where songs were all just thrown up and reordered based on the time of them?
I think I don't have a definitive answer
Yeah.
on that, Rob. I'm just thinking, myself. Um, if cassettes were kind of looked down upon by, the industry at large, I can only imagine that for a different reason, eight tracks were looked down upon because I'm sure a lot of purists would think, well, this is not the proper way to experience an album. Now, from a practical point of view, and there is a chapter in my Unspooled book about how these eight tracks actually worked, my understanding is that they tried as much as possible to keep all four of the programs as equal in length as
Yes.
possible,
Hmm.
which explains number one, why the songs were reordered, and number two, why they had to split songs up. If you were
Yeah.
lucky,
Yeah.
the song that was split up, if there was enough room at the very end, they'd reprise that song, or
All
they'd
right.
stick on there again whole. But
Yeah.
yeah, I know that bands think very hard about what's the first song, what's the last song on side one, what's the first song on side two.
Hmm.
There's an order to it. With eight tracks, that goes out the window. But again, it's the convenience and the portability won out. It's like, look, I just want to hear these songs. I don't particularly care what order they're in. And I think that the thought process was, well, yeah, they'll buy the eight track to listen to at parties or when they're driving. They'll buy the record to listen to at home, and that's how
Right.
they're,
Right.
because with an
True.
eight track, I mean, even worse than a cassette. With a cassette, you put the cassette in, you take the J card out, and you fold it out, and you look at it. With the eight track, half of your artwork is inside the machine. There's no checking the song titles again unless you call the thing out. So
Yeah.
it's a really strange format. It's the only one I can think of where the artwork was all contained within the one unit. And also, I think another part of the reason why they try to keep the programs the same length is because you couldn't rewind eight tracks. You could only fast forward them.
Right. Right.
And if you were 2 minutes into program one and you're like, I really want to hear the first song on program two, you'd advance forward. Well, you wouldn't advance to the beginning of program two. You're now 2 minutes into the next program.
Yeah.
you're where you were, and as thin as the tape inside of a cassette was, the 8-track, the tape was maybe not as thin, but it was divided into four. Those programs were a 4/4, and each turn it turned a quarter turn, which is
Yeah.
also why eventually you'd have two songs playing at the same time. You'd get the corresponding song on another program.
Right.
Really, really strange format.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And even stranger format to write a book about. But and see, that's I think where the cassettes were, I just think they were more in tune with what the artist had in mind, because the song order was preserved.
Hmm.
Side 1 and 2 was preserved.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one thing that, cassettes, I guess, and 8-tracks had going for them is that, if a band put out a double album, whether it's a live album or just 2-record set, well, they could still fit that on one cassette or one
Hmm.
8-track. But
Right.
what's interesting is if you take an 8-track of a double record and then you just have a single record, you could feel the difference in your hand.
Mm.
There's a lot more tape inside one of those. But yeah, that's as much as I know, that's why the songs were mixed up. I don't think that artists paid too much attention to what their music was going to sound like on 8-track, except there are some strange cases. Like the famous one is I think it's Pink Floyd's Animals album, where there's the 8-track version has like 10 seconds of music that isn't on any other format.
Oh,
Did it to
yeah.
get from one part to another. I'm not
Yeah.
sure of the
Yeah.
story on that, but for the
Hmm.
most part, you're not gaining anything on the 8-tracks. You're probably missing
Right.
things.
Right.
So, you
And
know.
I love the example also. I can't remember what tape it was that you had where it actually had notes on the tape saying,
Oh,
oh, there's going to be 9 minutes, 5 minutes blank at the end of this
yeah.
program.
I
Yeah.
know exactly what you
Yeah.
mean, Rob, if I can get to it in a timely manner. Yeah, here it is. It's Robert Plant's
Ah,
Pictures at
yeah.
which is a late period retail 8-track, because it was towards the end of the retail life. And it says, uh, due to programming, there's 3 minutes and 51 seconds of silence. So basically your average song length at the end of program 1, 43 seconds of silence at the end of program 3, and 31 seconds of silence at the end of program 4. And the reason they did that was to preserve the running order of the
Running
songs.
order makes sense.
Which makes me wonder if 8-tracks had continued in a retail format, if they would have really kept doing that and say, look, we don't care how much space there is at the end of this. The songs are meant to be heard in this order, but obviously things change. The industry evolves, and that's another one of the reasons why I was so fascinated to find out that they made certain titles all the way up through 1988 was because I said, you mean to tell me that if you were a member of the Columbia House Record Club between 1986, we'll say, and 1988, you had four choices of format. So 8-tracks coexisted along with side CDs. That makes no sense. So, um, and something that I've learned over the years, Rob, is that in territories like Malaysia and Indonesia,
Hmm.
they kept on making cassettes all the way through the late 2000s, like 2006, 2007, which is pretty surprising. So
Cassette tapes, you're saying.
yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah.
much like eight
Yeah.
tracks in the 80s,
Yes.
in certain countries they lasted longer than anyone would
Oh,
have ever.
absolutely. Absolutely. And in certain subcultures, like, noise musicians who,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah,
who,
I mean, if we're not talking strictly about major label music,
right.
cassettes have never gone away for some of
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
indie scenes.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, folks, do yourself a favor if you're looking for a really good in-depth read, especially if you're like me and you grew up with cassette tapes. This is like a love letter to the cassette. It's like a mixtape to the cassette. Uh, Rob Drew, Unspooled, How the Cassette Made Music Shareable. It's available now on Amazon. And Rob, I want to thank you so much for talking to me here. And yeah, we're like the only two people I know of that have books called Unspooled. So yeah, that puts us in the category. I don't know what that category
Well,
is, but
I feel like I'm in good company, so I appreciate it, Tim. It's
thank you.
really a
Thank you very
pleasure.
much.
Thank
Um,
you.
So Rob, thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming on, folks. Buy Rob's Unspooled book. Buy my Unspooled book. Buy them both. They're the gifts for people that you don't know what to get them for. They're great reads. So yeah, I want to thank everybody for watching this episode. Please remember to like and subscribe. Link to order the book, Rob's book, and my books will be below. And we'll see you next time on Tim's Vinyl Confessions. We'll see you all later.